Hey there, Technomancers, it's Jacques Graven, and welcome to another episode of Hack the Hologram. I get to sit down today in a little bit of an interview with the CTO, my first in a series of these, with Rowan Ziman from Teljoy. He is the Chief Technology Officer as well as the Director IFT of a company that's been with us in South Africa for more than 50 years. This is a company that's moved in from the retail space and is now moving into merchant and payment gateways with a whole bunch of other new and interesting things that they are working on and developing behind the scenes. I get to sit down today with Rowan, who's a dear friend as well as a brilliant CTO, to explore the ins and outs of the technical debt. How do we take on legacy systems? How do we work with remote teams? How do we translate requirements over from non-technical parties? And how do we get people that have been set in a very specific frame of mind with best intentions to adopt higher risk profiles, as well as what is the ways to actually demonstrate that to invoke trust with the team? So if you are finding yourself in the exploration of growing and expanding, I think you will find a lot of useful insights from Rowan's years of experience. But without any further ado, sit back, relax, and let's learn some new techniques.
Technical debt is something that destroys a lot of startups.
Yeah.
They're not thinking through that. They don't even know what the metrics are to measure, I think, in the first place. They kind of come with this wonderful idea. Maybe they've done a degree of research, but they're not necessarily clear on what are the existing available solutions. What is the actual fundamental need? And I like that idea of almost deleting things sometimes from the spec, because they're nice to have and people will say, oh, we need this. But what's the actual business case for it?
Yeah.
How do you argue that, though?
From a startup perspective.
Yeah, start there.
Yeah, I think the mindset for that startup is a little bit different though, because the mindset for that startup is get to market quick. And it depends what type of business it is. You may not even have done any due diligence around those requirements. So how do you now start to say, let's remove X, Y, and Z when you're going to market with some brain fart, which may or may not be a great idea, but you want to get to market?
Yes.
So I think that discussion is a bit more difficult, for that CEO, which you pray he's got some involvement in the technical side of things. At least understands it. But the second you write that code, the second you write any line of code, technical debt is there, right? So I think that would be a bit of a challenge. How do you mitigate technical debts or the magnitude of technical debt by limiting requirements where the requirements more often than not haven't even been vetted or tested in the market? I think the conversation will shift quite differently later on in the business's life cycle. When potentially you can actually talk to your customers directly. You've got customers, hopefully, and you can almost test those in a sandboxing environment or an A/B test, as opposed to just going to market like a startup.
That's a good idea, a good thought, because I think there's that argument, right? The client's always right, or the client doesn't know what they want.
Yes.
Right. So which one is it? Like, I think especially in the South African climate. Like, so what's the choice there?
I think they're both right, oddly enough.
Okay.
The client doesn't know what they want, I think can hold true if you understanding the value add, or at very least understand the challenge that you perceive them to be having.
Yes.
So they may not know what they want, but they very much do know what their challenges are.
Yeah.
So, that'd be a great example to test my assumption on what am I solving for, right? Is what I'm solving for solving? Is it a real challenge? They might not know what they want, but they know the pain point.
Yes.
The customer's always right. We are retail. Effectively a retail business. One would argue in retail the customer's always right, but to what degree? Where do you draw the line? Because if you start to cater, and I think it's been a great lesson for us, is at some point along our journey, we try to be something to everyone.
Okay.
And that was a bit of a problem. We can't be right for every single person. in our business in particular, in the rental space, a lot of people tear their nose up to it. I don't want to rent something and go and buy it, and that's fine. It's not for you. It's not for everyone. Us as a business, we can't, or any business, I guess, you can't be everything to everyone. And trying to do that, the customers are after which customer is the right customer for you. If it's the right customer for you, well, let's interrogate that. And I think that you can't look at one in isolation and say, well, they're always right, or they're not what they want. They both have their merits, provided you just diving just a little bit underneath.
So in terms of that kind of user avatar, like if you look at a company the size of Teljoy, was that when you stepped in a CTO kind of role and you moved into with the company, was that user avatar, that customer avatar, well defined? Or was it an exercise that you kind of had to work with, or is it one that's consistently evolving, or is it kind of like a set start?
Listen, I think for us, and in particular since I've joined, my role here has been around the digitization, optimization, and automation of the business. By virtue of that, the customer avatar has changed significantly over time. Either that, or we've understood our customer more over time. I don't know which one it is.
Makes sense.
But certainly one can say that when I joined, there was a bit of a hybrid.
Okay.
Were we trying to be everything to everyone? What was that meaning for us? And then, again, that leads itself into pitfalls that you're solving for things for potential customers who actually aren't customers. And that is a financial cost to the business.
Yes.
So bottom line, So I guess it's been a little bit more interesting in my journey, just seeing the evolution of that requirement come to light. Where we're a little bit more observant and understanding of what that is, and that's translated itself back into our marketing.
Okay.
Because in the marketing can start to direct their efforts in the right space, as opposed to spray and pray.
I like that. It's a bit more a technical and data-driven decision. My curiosity there is, how do you argue that? Because it's out of that process coming in, you have to kind of define technical requirements. You have to kind of figure out like what's actually value-driven for the real clients and what are the nice to haves. Because I think everyone has that kind of speculative idea of what they think will work in the product versus what actually is not worth the time and effort to do it, even though it's a nice to have, versus we got to make that decision, cut those, and lock down on these specific things. How did you kind of make those choices?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think again our approach, we've been quite fortunate, and my journey here has been quite fortunate in the sense that we've been running in a startup mindset with history of like a corporate backing, if that makes sense. Yeah. So we've got a nice hybrid, and what that's meant for me is I've had years of data to correlate and test against. And again, was that data true? A customer in the country 20 years ago was not shopping in the same way we're shopping.
Yes.
E-commerce was not what it was 20 years ago. But again, we drew a line in the sand. At some point, we ignored history. Okay. And we looked at customers from a certain date, whatever it was, 3 years, 4 years back. But even more so, I think what we did well was we started to interrogate our customer care avenues, or even the customer complaints, or even the compliments. So we started to interrogate that a lot more, and we would categorize our tickets. So we would look at our platforms and say, well, those customers coming through our platforms, querying things, complaining about things, whatever it was, that was our first point of call.
Okay.
Because by categorizing those, we could see where the biggest effort would have been. Correct. And then we could say, well, based on these, let's say the top 10 complaints and queries coming through the business, we could then shift that out and say, well, what's the quick ones to do? And you could almost put them into a matrix to say effort size, small, medium, large versus value. Right? So one could quickly say small effort, high value, those will be your low-hanging fruits. Let's do those now. So that becomes part of your prioritization matrix. So effort versus customer value, which to some degree is a little bit of a thumb suck because you're assuming that based on magnitude of queries or complaints would be more valuable.
I feel offset. That's which I think is common.
Which I think is a fair assumption to make, and maybe we didn't hit the mark every single time, but it's a factual decision. You've got the numbers, you've got a quadrant, and then you can start working through from there. And that's what we started to do. We started to knock out the low-hanging fruit, low effort, high value, and then start to prove that those initiatives coming in were realizing results. Because now you're actually, number one, we're targeting value to customer, real value to customer, and you're improving productivity in a certain business unit like customer care, right? Because their fielding of those complaints can be measured, that the complaints are dropping or queries in a certain area. So how we normally approach things, and how I like to approach these projects, is we'll put a hypothesis down. And the hypothesis would be, I don't know, we've seen X number of queries coming through per month. We believe that a project targeting that particular avenue to do X, Y, and Z should realize a 30% drop in queries.
Okay.
That's measurable.
All right.
Measurable, right? So then in your business case, as a tangible or as a measurable business case, you can say, well, 30% drop, I can quantify what that means from a productivity point of view. I can't quantify customer experience. That's always going to be a very difficult number to put down. And now you can go back into the business and say, right, it's going to cost me this number or even X amount of money based on effort to develop the solution. This is going to be the return. Let's attempt it. If the business and risk appetite is there from the business leaders or the CEO, whoever it may be, or the board, you put that measure in. 3 months later, you take a little bit of litmus test and see where you are. Did you hit that mark? Yes, we did with this investment. Beautiful. Let's carry on. Now you're starting to build trust. You're starting to build value-add decisions back into the business as a leader in.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. That makes that. I mean, that's perfect. Like, you've got the data, you've proven a series of test cases, you've got a hypothesis, you've clarified it. So it's very measurable in specific goals. You were able to use that as an argument and obviously stay flexible.
Sure.
Right? Are you hitting that measurement, or is your assumption incorrect?
Sure.
And now you're building up the data, and that becomes a good argument because you can demonstrate in marketing, this is the benefit. In business productivity, this is the benefit. What if you're coming into a space and you've got a lot of bias of old world view? Because you make an interesting point. You came in, there was a lot of data of commerce in the old days, pre-COVID, pre-online shopping. So there's established kind of certainty of, we've done this for this long. We've got these kind of cases. And there's obviously the knowledge of we need to stay relevant, to keep updating. How do you make those arguments to, I think, support or maintain rapport with a team that's still kind of embedded in those paradigms, and then support them going forward with this new idea?
That's a challenge. So just to clarify, we're saying the paradigms of the past.
Yes.
Yeah, listen, I think us, or myself, experienced that quite hard because, again, we're over 50 years old.
Yes.
Some of our employees have been here for many, many years. Some of their employees have seen us attempt these changes, these hypotheses, and it didn't work over the years. So here I come in, fresh, bushy tails, try and do these things, and they turn around and there's resistance because we've tried this before. That didn't work. Why would this be any different? And I think that's what you're kind of referring to, that those mentalities. And I had an individual who came to my team with almost that exact mentality. And I think one needs to understand where they're coming from. So all that individual really wanted, number one, was to be heard, which was fine. They were heard because they were critical to me moving forward because they had all the domain knowledge and prior understanding of why things were done the way they were done.
Yeah.
So we couldn't afford to lose individuals. I mean, they're very important to the business. But over time, and it took a long time. It wasn't a quick fix. It took some time.
Okay, to be fair.
But they their frustration was really stemming from a place of they didn't feel that they were adding value back into the business. So they wanted to be part of a winning team, and over the years, they felt that they're part of the losing team. So when a decision was made, their intention wasn't resistance to be malicious. At least from my experience, it wasn't a malicious blocking you for the sake of blocking you. They were coming from a place of saying, we've tried this before. I don't think your decision is right because we're going to fail. And I don't want to be part of a failing team again. And the only way that I could change that was first prove projects outside of that resistance that resulted in real wins. That they felt comfortable joining the winning team. Be on board with the winning team. And then what we did is we enabled the individuals to almost spec or be part of the decision-making process with those projects where there was resistance. So yes, 10 years ago, this didn't work. And maybe it didn't work because of X, Y, and Z. But you know what? Let's try it now. And we'll try it. And if it fails, we've adopted this philosophy and it's worked very, very well here. Fail fast. So let's don't be afraid to fail. And that's okay. Let's try something. And if it fails, at least let's know it fails, number one. So we have to have measures in place to understand what does failure mean, which talks back to the business case, right? What does failure actually mean? And do we have a finger on the pulse in terms of the measurement of that? If it were to fail, do we have a plan to go back to where we were before or to pivot? And that's quite important because the fear, and maybe I must add that as well, it was also their fear of failure. Which was stemming from this, right? Which is part of the losing team syndrome. Let's don't be afraid to fail. You're not going to lose your job. I'm enabling you to say, you're okay to fail, but you're okay to make mistakes in the change space. Not an operational space. In the change space, we're allowing failure, provided we understand what recovery looks like.
That opens up a lot, because firstly, what I'm hearing is the frame of, and it's again this mature frame of leadership and seniority versus the mid-level kind of experience, because the mid-level is going to immediately feel attacked and try to defend that position instead of understanding the real needs of the other individual and how do we move forward.
Or they may not have the autonomy to do that.
Yes, which is another kind of, how's that even argued? But the one I want to just kind of step back into, because you mentioned this fail fast idea. And you see that a lot with developers that, especially in the mid-range, they become very almost, I don't want to say religious, but they become very wedded to the idea of the technology framework or the knowledge space that they have. And they're afraid of looking stupid. And I've seen this with a variety of different companies where they don't want to admit ignorance. And because they're afraid of failure, in sense, how do you promote the environment where failure is a given if it's learned fast, and also so it does not curve the learning process but enhances it?
Listen, touching on quite a few issues there, and I think the first issue touching on is in the developer world, the technical world, there's this very big mentality of imposter syndrome. And it's very difficult for developers in this world. The technology is moving at such a rapid pace. One is to keep their job with all this technology around them, master everything. You can't just be a domain specialist in one certain thing like you could have 30 years ago.
Yes.
You've got to know everything all of a sudden, and you got to know everything tomorrow. And I feel that even when I was a professional developer, there was always this lingering feeling that you're comparing yourselves to those above you. You're comparing yourselves to maybe international developers who are all over the internet and telling you things, and you're saying, I don't know any of this. Am I really fit for the job?
Yes.
And I think playing into that is exactly that mindset of saying, well, imposter syndrome means that there's also a bit of an ego attached to it to say, well, I have to prove myself always. I've always got to know my stuff. And unfortunately, that what I see a lot is that results in two things. It results in developers, maybe not internally to the business, but outside the business, fearing saying, I don't know. Number one, you get into that ego side of things.
Yes.
And the other point that you touched on was the developers that I work with, more often than not, crave perfection as opposed to speed. And again, it touches on this mindset of ego might be the wrong word, but it is ego.
Yeah.
If we're not going to sugarcoat it, it is ego. It's a world which is made up of ego all over the place, even by virtue of how interviews are taking place in certain companies. Very much old boys club, ego, maybe assessments on paper, like silly things are being asked for which don't exactly reflect the job as of today.
Yeah, or the changing environment.
Or the changing environment. So your interviewing process more often than not doesn't reflect the actual job. It's more about you must pass these checks as a rite of passage before we accept you into this business.
And potentially lose great talent as a result of it.
Not potentially, there's definitely 100%. These guys get through that. I'm sure there are a few businesses out there that the interviewing process aligns properly to the work as opposed to a gateway, the rite of passage to get in. But more often than not, that isn't really the case.
Again, especially in larger groups where HR is managing it, or other groups, and it's not usually the technical team that's actually even making those decisions.
Potentially, but also even the technical team will still put blockers in the way to say, well, I'm going to give you a riddle as an example. You must put it. Even Google at some point loves these sort of riddles.
Yes,
and it's fine. You're testing out of the box, thinking you will argue and testing all these things, but are you really testing the person? Are you really testing the person in the job? And again, I think it's a whole different argument around how you onboard new developers. Maybe we'll get to that just now. But I think just to take us back a bit to that mindset side of things. And I think again, what I would always talk to my developers about in the beginning of any engagement, and in fact, talk to the potential interviewing process of a third party or of a developer who's going to be a full-time working with us, is number one, are you willing to make mistakes?
Yes.
Right? We need to understand that. There's a passion involved there, not just a working through the code. But again, I'm talking the different types of developers. I'm talking about a developer now in sort of a change space, right? So maybe we can talk about that just now. It's for types of developers that I've come across.
Yes.
But in that environment, perfection cannot be the end game, because otherwise you get stuck in this perpetual loop of saying, just one more thing. I need to get this done. I need to get this. I need to get this. And then we're stuck 12 weeks later, and we haven't really progressed.
Yes.
And one also needs to be cognizant of the fact that the last 20% of your project takes 80% of the time. So at what point are you going to market? At what point are you testing this hypothesis? Because your pivot points are more often than not going to be what you're thinking the most important things are. Yes. And in fact, those most important things for you right now probably going to be thrown out the window in a year's time.
Very true.
If not sooner.
Very true. Like you can't have any sacred cows, so to speak, when it comes to say
100%.
Because you don't know. Like you can have all the initial internal arguments, and if it hits market, then only do you really know. So I think like the concept of the different type of developers is very interesting. And that leads me also to your own kind of progress in that sense, right? Because the mindset from just developer to CTO moving through the stack is very, very different. It's completely different people almost that you have to be at these different stages. What are the patterns that you've seen as mentioning from different developers, both in-house, outsourced, and then just in your own experience? And then what do you have noticed are the key metrics for someone that's actually got the potential to move from that into a higher position versus their life? They're going to be there, until the end.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think let's start with the different types of developers, I guess. What I've noticed is at very least the developers can swing to one of two sides. The one side being an operational developer, as I would call it.
Okay.
And maybe that's where the developers start. So in the world we're living in, and we've got access to so much information, it's very easy to come into the tech world without a formal education. And there's no problem with that. No one says you have to have a formal education. You don't have to do a BSc to become a developer. But no one actually cares. You can go to a couple of Udemy courses and you'll get hired. That's not even a requirement anymore.
As long as the portfolios.
As long as the portfolio's there. But what that does mean is it depends where you are on your journey, of course. It does mean it depends on how you got there and how you built those skills. There could be a foundation lacking.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So you might have just come in and said, I'm just going to start doing PHP. or C# and you start writing code.
No background in computers.
No background in computer science, and you haven't gone through the fundamentals of how this thing is working under the hood.
You're missing first principles.
You're missing first principles. You're getting stuff done. But what you're doing is you apply.
Yes.
Right? You just plan things together. You go onto Google or ChatGPT these days and say, how do I tie this and this together and enjoy them together?
Yeah.
We have a Stack Overflow,
Yes.
which was back in the day.
Yeah.
But when things go wrong, do you know how to fix it? Right? And that becomes a challenge. And maybe those developers, maybe this is where the conversation starts, is those people would start more in an operational role where they're doing bug fixes. So you come onto the system and you're just managing the system. You come in, there's a framework already in place, the code structure's already there, you maybe got documentation on conventions, whatever it is, and you come in and you just hack away at fixing things.
You have your story and
that's it.
sprint points.
That's it. You get a change, come in, put the change into a system, no problem, you do your thing, you test it, you run, you go.
Yes.
Fine. On the other side is a developer who has the ability, and I guess it's closer to an architect, developer who has the ability to construct an entire framework from scratch, right? Does he understand the choice of technology? Does he understand the choice of frameworks?
Yes.
Does he understand the choice of structure? And why is everything in place, right? And that's quite difficult because you're starting from blank slate thinking,
Exactly.
right? Which you need a myriad of knowledge and comforting yourself so this thing's going to hold up.
Right. Yeah.
Now, these two I found are very different. They're very different people, in fact. And even this person who's a change agent, who's able to split these things up, they may not even have years of experience, but they're willing to take that risk. And I find that person, and it almost talks to the next point, has a bit of a bigger thinking mindset. He can see past the individual requirement.
Yes.
Not potentially, he has to be thinking of the future because your technology choice has to be at least future-proof to some degree, right? So you're thinking outside of that particular paradigm of change.
Yeah.
So you're thinking future, you're thinking bigger picture, you're looking with a bird's eye view of what you're trying to solve for. And I think that exact mindset of high-level thinking or bird's eye view or helicopter thinking is what can help a person rise up, if they want to, by the way, post out above that developer into a management sort of role, which isn't for everyone, right?
True.
A technical resource diving down is the opposite. They're diving down into technology. They're becoming a subject domain expert in that certain area, which is fine, no problem. But doing so, you're putting on blinkers into technology and into a route, becoming the expert in that. But you can no longer look top down.
Yeah. Rootloom's trapped by the education.
Well, trapped implies that it's a bad thing.
Fair.
So, and I don't think that's fair to say to someone who loves the technology so much, doesn't want to deal with people, because developers notoriously are introverts.
Yes.
So I don't want to deal with people. Let me just do my thing, which is fun. For the other side of the coin, the person who's a global thinker, can look at things at a high level, enjoys people, right? Can say, all right, well, maybe I do want to go into a management sort of position with a foundational understanding of the hardcore tech, but I'm thinking bigger than just this particular problem.
Innovation has always been in different areas, the overlapping of different disciplines and finding the matching patterns within them. And so you need to have those as kind of the innovators, and then but you do also need to have the solid specialists that can actually complete that project until its full scope. Correct. And understand the potential risks that the generalist may not be able to perceive because of that position. So how do you, when it comes to the hiring process, working with teams, both internal and external, how do you identify those and which are going to be the decisions you're going to make for a team that you're going to be working with? You've been through the gauntlet there.
It's so difficult to do that. How do you identify a person who fits into one of those buckets? And I don't think there's a right answer here. One can talk it through their personal portfolio of projects. What have they done on GitHub? To try and work out. But I've always found, even by doing that, even if they were to do assessments, it's almost impossible the latest thing we've tried to do is we would give a individual a project.
Okay.
Completely outside of their understanding or their knowledge base. So if, for example, you're a C# developer, here's a PHP project for you, as an example, and vice versa. Completely outside, right? Here's a project, go and create a little microsite or a little thing that can do this, or a calculator, I don't know, something small, a couple of hours that can do after their current job, but more likely they're employed. And what we're looking for there is their ability for them to learn very quickly a new technology and build something, even if it's just piping.
Yes.
Even if it's just a plumber.
How do they adapt?
How do they adapt to that? Because that then talks to the persona saying, are they even able to escape their own area of comfort? So that's step one, right? So that filters out very quickly the others. But even still, the ones who are able to do that, it doesn't necessarily mean when the pressure's on in the job and in the role that they're able to expand beyond. So unfortunately, for me, that can only get unpacked on the job.
So is it a case of hire fast, fire faster?
Yes.
So to speak. So that kind of describes, I think, a lot about identifying the technical ability to a degree and the cognitive ability of the user. How important in today's world, post-COVID, remote work, remote teams, is the company culture, behavioral kind of mix still in terms of working with remote teams and developers? Is it a value? Is the value metric the most important? Is time metric the most important? What are the kind of key factors there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a lot of developers would face a similar sort of question. And it's interesting in the South African context. What a lot of companies still measure as productivity is time on seat.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a problem. But it also works both ways. One needs to understand why that's happening in the context of our economy versus internationally. There's still this hybrid work, but even there, they're calling back to the office. Elon Musk, all these guys, they want you back in the office. Wow. In general, it's an age-old question. How do you measure developer productivity, the lines of code? How do you know how well they're working? And for me, there's only one way. It has to be value adds. And at very least, are we doing value adds in the time that we predict? Now we're talking about estimations of time, which every developer hates. There's underlying complexities, devil's in the detail. We don't quite know until we know, but no business accepts that.
Yes.
I've always used an analogy. If you want to build a new home, right? And you said, all right, well, I want to build a double-story, 6-bedroom home. Great, what's it going to cost me? Well, let me go ask an architect or a builder to give me a price. Right? If they turned around and said, listen, John, I need 6 million rand from you, but I actually don't know how long it's going to take me. It might be 10 million rand or 20 million rand. You're never going to accept that. Yeah. You're going to want a project to say, well, guys, I might pay you a bit more, but you need to give me a deadline. I need to sell my house maybe, I need to make plans, I need to be living somewhere else. You're going to want concrete plans when your house will be complete.
Yes.
And even in there's still slippage, but there's something. So while we might hate the concept of estimations, it's important to understand those costs,
especially in a business.
100% in the business. But I mean, if a developer, if somebody is providing value to the business reliably, right? Can the business turn around, or is it fair for them to turn around and say, "Well, come back to the office"? You probably argue it's not fair. But then I'll give you an interesting anecdotal story for this, and this happened quite recently on our talk. We've got teams of developers, right, working with us. Some of which are remote. Actually, most are remote, but we check in occasionally in the office, more of a hybrid approach. We had an issue where something wasn't working on one of our platforms. Our remote team was responsible for this particular piece of work and it needed to be resolved immediately. Okay, no problem. Now, unfortunately, it was a series of just unfortunate events that had happened. The one developer was on leave, there's only one available, and he had decided at that moment, without telling me, he's going to the shops
Okay.
during working hours. which I'm sure everyone does. You need to go run an errand. Just FYI, please inform your manager if you're going to do that. Please. He did that, and he said he'll be back in an hour. No problem. 3 hours later, the issue is not resolved, and we can't get hold of him. And the point I'm making is those sort of incidents don't inspire confidence that we're able to self-manage our own time when working remotely. If you were in the office, you're not going to just go out and randomly go and run into your personal errands between those hours. So one also needs to be cognizant of the responsibility you have when working remotely and being mature enough to understand what your time commitments are, or at very least what your responsibilities are to that business.
Yes.
And I think a lot of companies have seen that, they've been taken advantage of. So they're calling them back just from a discipline point of view, or just to have them there. I don't know, so I stand to be corrected if any companies are using that as a source of productivity, your time on the seat. Because if that's the case, then I don't deliver value ever, but I'm on the chair. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that's not going to be accepted regardless.
There's a problem with both.
There's a problem with both, yeah.
And I think the argument you're making is quite a valid one, because I think if you're in collaboration with a team where there's codependencies, everyone's working on a portion of work that has a communication requirement with each other, then time on seat or time in office kind of really has a big value pair, because the more you're out, no communication, that's a buffer or a blocker for other team members, which again reduces productivity. Versus when it's a more isolated space that doesn't have the dependency, it's a startup, they're still kind of inventing, coming up with an idea. There's one person doing the tech, another person doing marketing and design, and it's a small team of 3 people. Maybe a little bit less important, still useful, but less important is when you're scaling that team.
But maybe you're right, maybe to a lesser degree. However, even with a smaller team, the codependencies on one another is actually higher because there's no distribution of work.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, my responsibility, let's talk about the startup as example, if it's a single developer, single person in marketing and single person in sales, the synergy between them has to be extremely tight because of the person marketing has to be what the person who can sales can achieve, and then ultimately what the developer can deliver. And the timing of that has to be very much in sync. If it's not, you're selling dreams.
It's true. We've seen the failure in digital agencies with sales teams are promising deadlines, not communicating with the dev team that aren't realistic, and that causes a number of problems.
Standard, right?
Yeah. Speaking of problems, like you stepped in and you inherited quite a code base and quite a structure and everything, and you've gone quite innovatively and produced completely new systems, things that are still in innovation, really taking the company to new heights, moving into gateways and other areas like that. That's not a simple decision to make. It's not a simple argument to make. What made you decide to almost cut portions of those technologies, invest in completely new areas, and what was the biggest challenge, not only from a business perspective to shift, but technically in order to adapt?
Yeah, so you're right. So I inherited a system at the time I was 20 years old. I thank God it could have been worse. I've seen much worse systems. It's not as bad. It was an old system, but at least it was recently okayish technology.
Yeah. You need to hire COBOL developers.
Yeah, not that bad. Exactly right. You mentioned, but find those guys in the grave somewhere. But the challenge is always going to be how do you optimize or change those train tracks when the train is still going on them?
Yes.
Right? It's always a developer's problem. The train is still running, yet now you want me to move this train track. Right? That's what the pressure of our industry is. And that is probably the single biggest issue I had that this business is running. It's doing what it wants to do, yet I'm hired to pivot the business in a different direction. Not a different direction, but a direction for optimization. And this train is going. And not only is the train going, we don't quite understand every single decision being made and why it was made. Why is this train track sitting here? Why is it facing this way? And sometimes one can argue with the legacy system, how does a train even get over this train track?
Yes.
I don't know. Should it? right?
It's compiled.
I don't understand that.
Yeah.
And these are big problems to have. And the problems are going to be, to some lesser degree or even larger degree, faced by everyone with technical debt. The older it gets, the worse it gets, I guess. The only choice I had, to be honest with you, the choice was made for me, because I had to move quickly. I had to show value, and I had to build something that was going to at least start moving the business. And again, it talks to this idea of building trust back into the business. The idea for a lot of RT department, I'm going to derail slightly here, is RT is often an order taker to the business. Usually, right? So you get told to do something. Jacques, go and build me X, Y, and Z. Okay, right. We talk about timelines, all these things, no problem. You get told what to do. That's normally what happens. The problem with that approach is that business is missing out on the value adds that the technical department can give, because they're at the coalface.
Yeah.
They can see things, they can provide ideas on stuff that the business hasn't even thought about. The value adds coming out of RT are massive and often underrated. So one needs to leverage themselves, or should leverage themselves outside of an order taker into the business to become what I would term a business partner, right? Where you're now seen on equal footing to the business in terms of decision making, as opposed to those guys in the dark room downstairs who are told what to do. And a shout if it doesn't work, right? That's a paradigm shift.
Yes.
Right? Especially for the business context. And there's methods to leverage yourself out of that. So back to the point, one has to one has to start showing value into the business, proving yourself outside of an order taker to gradually shift out.
Create that trust.
To become eventually that business partner. That's imperative.
Yes.
So back to your question, I knew I had to get out of that, right? Because we were very much at that point an order taker. Go and do this.
Yeah.
Business knows better.
And by the way, there's a deadline.
Of course, there's always just it's never going to disappear. What is very good. But we have to get out of that. We have to show value. We have to prove ourselves to be innovative and providing innovation back into the business, as opposed to be seeing, well, innovation's happening here, you must implement it.
Yeah.
Right? So when you got this legacy system running, and you need to prove value, the only option I had, without understanding how to even move this Titanic, because I didn't even understand what was going on underneath it, was to start creating parallel processes and parallel systems. It was the only choice I had. And that's what we started doing. We started creating parallel systems which were optimized for the digital world. They were optimized for technology and optimized for automation. And then all we would do is we would just stop I won't say derailing, we'd just stop piping the train in to leveraging these new technologies. So train is still running, but we're slowly modularizing the legacy system outside of itself. And so that's one approach I guess that we took. There's many other approaches, but our Sunsets approach was modular based, because it allowed us to unpack in isolation the decisions made, and we actually didn't even unpack things, to be honest. We couldn't. We just made new decisions on what needs to get done, and then we moved the train off. It's this parallel path.
When you were doing that, was that kind of department based? Was that functionality based? What was the driver of decision there?
It was a bit of both. It depends what we wanted to achieve. So, if we wanted to achieve a certain value add, and in this instance, it was going to be a customer experience in the digital e-commerce world. E-commerce journey cross-cuts departments. In an e-commerce website, you've got marketing embedded in the website, you've got sales, you've got distribution, you've got warehousing, right? That's all cross-cutting on any e-commerce website. But the value add and functionality is a fully fledged platform,
yes,
right? Which cross-cuts. So we would look at it from again, the prioritization of value, right, regardless of department. And once we had started showing something, then at least we were given a little bit of breathing room. All right, well, now let's start targeting maybe a departmental process which ultimately affects the customer, or the business or the bottom line or whatever that return is going to be, right? And start moving through like that. But I guess that was just incidental. I guess the approach was always going to be value add every single time.
And do you define value add in terms of this is what everyone in the business believes is the most viable, or is this the hardest problem or the most client demanding problem to solve?
No. So I don't think one can take the approach of what everyone in the business believes, because you're never going to get consensus on that. Because it gets much worse the bigger the business is, the more people there are. Even amongst developers, again, back to the ego story, you may not even find consensus.
And the hierarchy isn't right.
Exactly. So there has to be a framework in place from a business side, at very least, on what that looks like. Right? Number one. And the truth is, when that happens, that's going to go in regardless, and then it becomes change management to get everyone on board.
Yes.
But they have to come on board. And again, that's another discussion altogether, how to bring them on board and how to make sure the product or the system, whatever it is utilized and adopted. But I don't think the metric is around difficulty, complexity, because if that's the approach, again, something hard may not be valuable.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And again, to use my example, hard would have been ripping out the entire system, right, shutting it down and building a new one. That would be tough. For what value?
Yes. And what risk business?
And what risk?
Yes. Exactly.
So cool, but what am I measuring against? And that's why I'm saying the choice is always going to be value. Now, the question we can ask is value where? Value to bottom line in the business, value to customer, value to department. What are we actually targeting in terms of value? Because it can be any one of those,
yes,
right? But one has to know what you're targeting. And if there's no value, well, then why would the business accept it? They're not going to accept paying a developer or an IT department or a consulting house or an agency to build something if there's no value.
Yeah, exactly.
That's always where the discussion starts and ends. So that's what the target, that's the entry point. That's what it has to be, right? And then the decision is going to be, well, value is number one, right? If that's number one, or the implementation risk, cost, and timelines is going to be secondary to that, do you accept it or not?
Yes. I think this also creates the opportunity, as you're doing that, to set new systems in place that weren't there, to test those systems and evolve those systems. Your own evolution in terms of this development, when we talk about this value add, your own values must have evolved quite a lot from the early days of developer, as well as your priorities in terms of mindset, from where it was to where it is today. What are some of the biggest kind of value shifts and kind of mindsets that when you're looking at new chain, making those decisions for doing these things, that is critical to you, that's been the most proven?
It's tough. I think what the success has been, and in particular how my thinking has evolved over the years, particularly has been around the concept of speed. And let's not use market, because market is going to assume as a customer. Speed to production.
Okay.
And I think embedded in that comes with interesting concepts, and there's been many learnings I've had over the years from others around me. And some of the examples would be, there are certain individuals, business individuals, who could argue that, well, you can shut down the whole technical department, shut down every system, and we can run this business on a spreadsheet. Okay? And it's a great thought to have, because if you can run this business on a spreadsheet, am I really that smart? Like, what am I actually building? I'm just building then what? A database with a couple of user interfaces.
Yeah.
So that almost brings you back down to earth to say, well, if a spreadsheet is my starting point from a process point of view, and you can run the whole business on that, then surely I can go to market with that idea that the perceived value is what people can see. You would agree. The technical person can't show perceived value through a database design, unfortunately. We'd love to. An optimized database that's scalable and highly available, beautiful, but no one's going to care outside of RT.
Yes.
Right. So that's where front end comes in. Front end is value, perceived value, but it's value because it's tangible. You can see it. A website, you can see. System, you can see. An app on the phone, you can see. What happens underneath that hood, nobody can see. And I think what we've done exceptionally well is that it is adopted the approach will at least provide perceived value quickly. Get that thing into their hands, even if it means behind the scenes, I'm storing it on a spreadsheet, on a Google form somewhere, or behind the scenes, manually sending emails and pulling strings and doing stuff, right?
Yes.
Worst case, you don't want to be there. I'm saying, listen, this is very much a cowboy approach. What I'm talking about now is not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah.
You know, so not everyone's going to agree with me on this approach, and
Have that risk tolerance.
and that's fine.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But having that approach and having that sort of cowboy attitude, for lack of a better word, allows one to get the product or get the system or the app or whatever it is into hands quickly and then iterate exceptionally fast.
Yes.
And again, that talks to my fundamental principle, fail fast. You can't fail fast if you spend 6 months in development.
Yeah.
Get it into their hands. You're not sleeping for 3 days. Okay. It seems to help you not sleep. I don't know. Distribute the load, right?
Yes.
Or whatever it may be, but then learn. And then you can quickly see where the importance is. Is the importance going to be around optimizing your SQL database?
Yeah.
Or is the importance going to be around making something look good, which is what you're after,
Yes.
and then get the learnings and pivoting quickly? And ultimately, what that allows one to do is actually cheaper in the long run, or actually in the short term, because you wouldn't have really committed time and effort to something that you weren't sure about. The pivoting time is a lot quicker. The caveat of this whole approach means if it were to scale fast, you're in trouble, because features won't be there, manual processes may be there, and you may be stuck in a position where you'd have to do things that maybe temporarily just to get yourself out of that hole.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a caveat that one needs to be aware of if you're making this sort of, there's like two markets.
So there's a risk nonetheless.
Correct.
I mean, but the argument is, from what I'm interpreting, you could spend all this time in designing a microarchitecture in AWS, using all of its structures and, working across analysis, planning UX and UI, going through the entire wireframe exercise. And that's wonderful and technically the right process to go through. But ultimately, you could do all of that and find no client likes the thing. Right? I think that was the idea behind Notion. Notion, he did all of that work, built the thing, no one wanted to use it. And then spent 2 years just working on that interface and testing it with people in coffee shops in order to kind of get to that next level. So going in, and I think as we move to kind of like a close toward our conversation today, you've obviously, in scaling that, had to work with a lot of different teams, because resources aren't necessarily immediately available. You've got a large demand, working with teams in India, working with teams in South Africa, across the board. What's been the biggest learnings? Because now you're in a place where you're, I say, pretty stable. You've got reliable teams, you've got people to work with, you've got a flow. That wasn't always the case. What were the key learning factors there that somebody should be considering when they're starting off in that space?
Yeah, so I really think there's two. Number one is clear communication.
Okay.
It actually all boils down to clear communication, because expectation management cannot be set if you yourself are not clear of what you want to achieve.
Yes.
Right? And the second, talk to that similar point, is it probably should be writing. Right? So we talk about a spec, maybe you've adopted a waterfall approach and its spec is all encompassing. More than likely you haven't, but that's where you can find yourself having a problem, because the developer, when you hand over to them, and again, they want to work quickly, they want to show value, they're going to make assumptions, right? And their assumptions are dangerous, because depending on how new they are in your business and as part of your partner portfolio, those assumptions could be completely incorrect.
Yes.
Right? So one says, the Agile Manifesto, regular touch base and checking on the product. But even still, are you yourself doing code reviews? Are you yourself looking into the quality of that code? Which, is not a pitfall, but that's a different discussion. But ultimately, it's going to have to boil down to, your expectations have to be set very clear out to whoever developer, teams of developers, whatever it is, exceptionally clear, right? So when it comes back to you and you look at it, you can't be upset or angry that something wasn't done if you've missed the mark on leaving the door open to assumptions and uncertainty.
Yes, you just wrote the story. I want a messaging system. No qualification, no test criteria, none of this information.
Bad data in equals bad data out.
Yes.
Right. So for us, that's probably been the best lesson learned, which is simple, right? It sounds quite simple.
But the granularity of the thing is the challenge.
Correct. Exactly that. Yeah. So you talk in blocks and high levels, where they get into the detail, they start doing whatever they want.
Yes.
So again, we could spend hours talking about this, but even architecturally, they're not going to be potentially not thinking about this in the long term. They're thinking about solving the solution for you right now, and they'll probably solve it for you. But in 6 months' time, when you want to add on to it, your system doesn't allow for that because you didn't think of the future.
Yes. I've always taken the paradigm, because there's the common view that software development is like architecture, and I tend to think of it actually more like authoring a book, in the sense of someone's giving, especially legacy piece, you're getting a book and now somebody's asking you to change the character profile of one of the characters. You need to go read through everything, context, dependencies. You may assume, but you didn't really consider until you've read through everything. And that alone is a big buffer time. And especially when you're in the early stages, people are coding on a project or a piece. They don't know what the rest of the story kind of looks like. How do you, I think, because obviously you can't give everyone the time span to do that. You can't go, here's the book, you've got 6 months, work through it all, give me feedback. So you've got to break down minute tasks, you're managing different teams and different technology stacks. How do you allocate that? How do you manage these different teams on a day-to-day kind of basis to make sure everyone's moving the mark forward?
Yeah, listen, I think that has to be the primary role of a full-time employee in a business. Either it's going to be the full-time architect or the CTO. Somebody has to step up and take that role. And while you may not be able to give them that entire book to read, you yourself should know that book.
Yes.
You have to know that book, otherwise you can't move forward, right? So if that's the case, then at very least you know how to intermingle whatever it is you're working on based on history, right, as well as future. And that's why I'm saying that comes to very clear discussions and not at a high level. Clear discussions and regular check-ins to make sure that we're on track and we pivot when we have to, that aligns to what expectations are. If those doors of communication are not open, or those doors of communication are challenging because of maybe language or distance, whatever it may be, you probably have to find another method to get the point across outside of a communication. And there's ways to do that with technology, right? Maybe it's whiteboarding, maybe it's documentation. I don't know, but that expectation has to be set and maintained throughout. But it's a full-time job.
Closing question in this kind of conversational space. Leading edge technology has always been a problem. Everyone wants to jump on it. It's not fully kind of fleshed out or tested. Legacy, you have a lot of developers that kind of stick to the legacy idea. We know you can't always do that. You need to innovate. You need to kind of leverage these different technologies. So twofold question. One, your position on AI and the utilization of AI tools for coders. And two, your personal projection for developers, CTOs, people in the tech space, what they should kind of prioritize and what the landscape may be looking like in the next 2-3 years, specifically in the retail and commerce spaces.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word AI tool, because that's how I see it as well. It's become this big buzzword. It's going to take our jobs away from us, and it's a silver bullet, and it solves world hunger, and it does all these magic things.
For all the people removed from the code.
Exactly, yes. But it is a tool.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, with a shiny new hammer, everything looks like a nail. And one needs to be very careful of that. And this is not, we've seen this many times over the years with new technology, and it's a great technology, fit for purpose.
Yes. Faulty
for now in certain contexts, but it's a good technology. Right, just found where the fit is. I think again, back to that point, the the focus definitely is around AI. That's where the world is moving. There's very much a shift there to the utilization of AI into our general life as a tool. So again, are we using Copilot or chat GPTs or whatever is your flavor of the day, literally of the day, to assist you doing your job better. But what you're finding now is that where platforms were, and Google's quite a good example, if you were to think about how you would search back in the day for problems, even code problems, you'd have to work out your query, right? It couldn't be like a plain English query. You'd get ways of weighting things, and you use inverted commas and put characters everywhere, and you do things in a way that would get you the best results. More often not took you to Stack Overflow, but you typed it in a way to get your results.
Yes.
The way that you use the technology now to achieve something similar, you just type it in clear language, right? So our consumption of the technology, and Google's that example, has fundamentally changed. And I think for me, that's where the utilization, the focus should be, in particular in the retail space, the article, the commerce space, is the consumption of our systems. And we need to find a way, utilizing what we've got available, and as it progresses, to make it easier for our users to transact, to go through, to market it to whatever it is, in a way that it's like what Apple did many years ago. It was 2006 when the iPhone was launched. They fundamentally changed the landscape of something as simple as creating the whole thing as touchscreen.
Yes.
Bearing in mind, there wasn't new technology. We had glass available, we had screens available, and we had touch screen things, technology available. All he did was put the two together. The tech wasn't exactly new. It was the merging of the two fields which created this, right? And that fundamentally changed how we interact with technology ever since. And I feel that that's what the focus should be on going forward, is our interaction with the points, whatever those touch points would be for our customers and users across the board, to be honest.
Still considering due diligence, fault tolerance.
Sure.
If you feel like every developer now also using these tools himself must become the code reviewer and the reviewer of all of those little challenges and those things. How do you, when leveraging those tools, or when working with development teams in the remote space that are leveraging those tools? Because again, you may have a mixed set of criteria, and they want to be value add. And now you have two different developers using or leveraging these tools, and those tools don't necessarily consider the full scope of the book, the full scope of the code, which can introduce bugs, it can introduce problems, or at the very least, it can introduce performance weaknesses in terms of the scale. Do you just, sign those off as technical debt? Do you add that into the code review process? How do you handle that situation when it comes out?
Listen, I think from a business point of view, that's going to have to be judged on a case-by-case basis on what the appetite of that business is. I can speak on behalf of where I am and the position that I'm in. We're fortunate enough to have that carte blanche to play with new technology without fear of failure. Again, one needs to make sure that failure doesn't bring down a business.
Yes.
Doesn't completely bring down a customer experience or journey. There may be risks, maybe inherent risks, which you would need to at least understand and unpack and agree upon, and have a mechanism to roll back. But ultimately, anytime you want to progress with the technology, the best way to learn is going to be on the job with some sort of use case or test hypothesis or something.
Yes.
And again, that talks to your point of saying, well, again, Cowboy approach, but let me build something here. And even if it, there's this A/B testing methodology, which we haven't really utilized as much as we could have.
Not in the tech space as much as the marketing space.
Yeah, correct. But even then, one can limit those transactions to a certain parallel process and say, well, let me limit my transactions to 10 as an example. So I built a parallel process, but my risk appetite isn't as high as I'd like it to be. I can limit that exposure.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I can control that through the code. right? And I can start releasing as we go on. So almost like an A/B at the environment.
Yes. I wouldn't take a single API endpoint, put a load balancer in front of it, put certain amounts of traffic through, or even control traffic for a test. That's good, because you're always still sandboxing a component under a segment, and you can scale on demand or as trust is gained inside of it.
And actually, you can get confidence in your measurements, because your measurements now can be isolated and controlled, as opposed to getting millions. You can now limit it to 20. Well, I don't know, whatever you want it to be, right?
I love it. Rowan, fantastic ideas. Thank you so much for your brilliant insights. I appreciate it.